I was standing right there when my sister told the story of my illness, as if I weren't even in the room. She smiled the way people do when they believe they're being reasonable. She said my symptoms had come out of nowhere, that the doctors ran tests and found nothing, and that everything after that was me spiraling. She spoke calmly, confidently, like someone explaining a misunderstanding that had already been settled. The person she was talking to nodded along, relieved by how simple it all sounded. I didn't interrupt. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't say my name. What struck me wasn't just that she was wrong. It was how clean her version was. No pauses, no uncertainty, just a smooth line from nothing serious to overreaction, with no room for questions. And people accepted it, not because they knew it was true, but because it made them comfortable. I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. Recognition. She hadn't misspoken. She had rewritten the story. And she had forgotten one thing she couldn't control. Time. The room was full, but somehow I felt invisible in it. Chairs were pulled close together, voices low and familiar. My sister leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely, holding court the way she always had. She talked about me in the third person, like I was an anecdote instead of a human being with a pulse and a history. No one looked at me to confirm anything. No one asked how I remembered it. They listened to her because she sounded certain, and certainty carries weight in families like ours. It always had. I watched my mother nod slowly, the way she did when she wanted a conversation to end peacefully. I watched an aunt tilt her head with sympathy, not toward me, but toward my sister. The sympathy was for how hard it must have been to deal with someone like me. That was when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. This was a version being installed. As she spoke, I noticed the way she arranged events. Symptoms after the holidays, tests after the first scare, concern only after nothing showed up. It was tidy, too tidy, the kind of story you tell when you want everything to seem inevitable. I felt the familiar urge to speak rise up, sharp and immediate. One sentence could have stopped her, one clarification, one, "That's not how it happened." But I knew that feeling. I had followed it before, and it had never taken me anywhere I wanted to go. In our family, emotion was treated like a weakness. Calm voices were believed. Shaky ones were diagnosed. Every time I had pushed back in the past, I had been told I was too sensitive, that I was reading into things, that I needed to let it go. The more I tried to explain myself, the more it sounded like proof that something was wrong with me. So I stayed quiet. At first, my silence felt like swallowing glass. Every word she said scraped against memories I knew were real. I remembered sitting in exam rooms, waiting for results. I remembered the way the symptoms crept in, not all at once, but gradually, changing my days piece by piece. None of that fit her story. But as I listened, something else happened. The hurt dulled. In its place came a kind of focus. She said the symptoms appeared suddenly, after a certain point. My body reacted before my mind caught up. That wasn't right. Not emotionally wrong. Structurally wrong. I didn't argue with myself about it. I didn't try to reconstruct the past from memory. I simply noticed the sentence and let it sit there, separate from everything else she said. She kept talking. She always did when no one stopped her. What she didn't realize was that my silence wasn't agreement. It was calibration. I was no longer listening for tone or intention. I was listening for order, before or after, first or second, then or later. When she finished, the conversation drifted on without me. Someone asked about dinner plans. Someone laughed. The story had been delivered and accepted, and the room moved on. I stood there, still quiet, still invisible, and let the moment pass. I knew better than to correct one detail. Fixing a single sentence would only help her tighten the rest of the story. I had learned that early corrections save liars. They allow revisions. I wasn't interested in revisions. That night, alone, I replayed her words in my head, not to relive the pain, but to mark them. I didn't argue with them. I placed them on an imaginary line and looked at where they fell. Something was out of place. I didn't know how much yet. I didn't know where it would lead. But I knew this wasn't about memory anymore. It was about sequence. She had rewritten the story to make herself reasonable and me unreliable. And for a while that might work. People prefer stories that don't ask anything of them. But stories, no matter how confident, still have to sit somewhere in time. And once I started paying attention to that, I realized I didn't need to speak at all. I just needed to start counting days. Her version of the story didn't stay in that room. I noticed it first in the smallest way, the way a phrase repeats itself too cleanly. A cousin called me a few days later, her voice careful, and said she was sorry I'd been so stressed after everything turned out to be nothing. The words landed softly, but they weren't hers. They were my sister's, delivered intact, like a message passed hand to hand. I said thank you. I didn't correct her. I listened. After that, it kept happening. At a family lunch, an aunt mentioned how hard it must have been for my sister to deal with all that worry for no reason. A neighbor asked if I was feeling better now that the tests came back clear. Each time, the story arrived before I did, already formed, already accepted. It was strange to hear my life summarized so efficiently. My illness, which had stretched over months, reduced to a brief scare, followed by unnecessary drama. The gradual changes I'd lived through were flattened into a single moment that had apparently passed. There was no space left for questions, because the story itself didn't invite any. What unsettled me most wasn't the inaccuracy. It was the speed. People were borrowing the story without realizing it. They repeated it the way you repeat directions someone gave you earlier in the day, trusting that it must be right because it sounded sure. I'd hear my sister's phrasing echoed back to me, sometimes word for word, spoken by mouths that had never been in a doctor's office with me, never watched me struggle through ordinary days. They spoke about me as if I had already agreed. I would stand there, nodding along, feeling myself drift further from the center of my own experience. No one asked what I thought. No one paused to check. The story was doing its job. It made everything simple, and simplicity is persuasive. My silence started to take on a meaning of its own. At first, people seemed to interpret it as dignity. Then, as time passed, it became something else. A sign that I was embarrassed, or that I'd exaggerated and didn't want to admit it, or worse, that my sister had been right all along. I could feel that shift happening, subtle but decisive. Each time I chose not to speak, the space where my voice should have been filled itself with assumption. It was uncomfortable to watch, like seeing a room rearranged while you're still standing in it. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, I would replay conversations and wonder if I should have said something earlier, if letting the story travel unchecked was a mistake. One correction, I told myself. Just one. Enough to slow it down. But I also knew how those conversations ended. I'd lived through them before. Any attempt to clarify would be framed as defensiveness. Any insistence on details would be labeled fixation. The more I tried to explain, the more I'd sound like the problem my sister had already described. Her version offered relief. That was the part I hadn't fully understood at first. If her story was true, then no one had missed anything important. No one had dismissed early signs. No one had waited too long. It meant everything had been handled as it should have been, and the rest was just me having trouble letting go. That was a comforting thought, especially for parents who didn't want to look too closely at the past. I began to see how neatly her narrative fit into the spaces people needed it to fill. It asked nothing of them except agreement. It allowed them to feel reasonable, supportive, and finished with the whole ordeal. My story, the real one, was inconvenient. It was slow. It raised questions about timing and attention and responsibility. It didn't end cleanly. So I let her version move ahead of me, watched as it was adopted and reinforced, not out of malice, but out of ease. Every time someone repeated it, it gained a little more weight, a little more authority, and every time, I said nothing. What surprised me was how my feelings began to change. The initial sting dulled, replaced by something steadier. I stopped reacting to the words themselves and started listening to their structure. I noticed how my sister always placed certain events in the same order, how she avoided specifics unless she was confident they wouldn't be challenged. She spoke in broad strokes, and people accepted them because they didn't know what questions to ask. I did. I started paying attention to when she said things happened, not the emotions she attached to them, not the conclusions she drew, but the sequence she relied on to make her story hold together. I noticed how she described the onset as sudden, how she framed the testing as immediate, how she implied resolution before concern. It didn't sound right. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't align. The more her version spread, the more fixed it became. She repeated it often enough that she stopped adjusting it. The phrasing settled. The order hardened. She spoke as if the timeline itself were beyond question. That was when I understood the risk she was taking, even if she didn't. Stories that move quickly don't leave room for correction. But they also don't leave room for flexibility. Once people memorize them, they expect consistency. Any deviation stands out. I heard her tell the story again one evening, confident and smooth, and for the first time I noticed a date slip into the telling. It was casual, almost offhand, but it was there, a marker she hadn't used before. I didn't react. I didn't look up. I filed it away, the way you note a crack in a wall you're not planning to fix yet. Her story was traveling faster than I could stop it, but it was also stretching itself thinner with every retelling. And now that it had a shape, now that it had an order it depended on, I could see exactly where it might tear. I didn't need to chase it. I didn't need to interrupt. I just needed to keep listening until it showed me where it couldn't hold together anymore. Someone eventually asked me why I never corrected her. It wasn't an accusation. It came wrapped in concern, the way these things always do. We were alone for a moment, standing near the sink after everyone else had drifted into the living room. The question was casual, almost kind. "Why didn't you say anything when she tells it like that?" I smiled and shrugged, the way I'd learned to. I said I didn't think it was worth getting into. The answer satisfied her enough to let the moment pass, but it stayed with me long after she walked away. Because the truth was, I had said something before. Not recently. Not in those rooms where my sister now spoke uninterrupted. Earlier, back when I still believed that clarity would fix things. Back when I thought if I explained myself carefully enough, people would listen. I remembered one afternoon clearly. It came back to me as I stood there rinsing a glass, the sound of running water filling the space where the conversation had been. I had corrected a small detail then, nothing dramatic. I'd said the symptoms hadn't started all at once, that they'd been building for a while. I'd said it calmly, with dates I thought would help. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from listening. My sister hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She had tilted her head and smiled in that measured way of hers, and said I was being too sensitive, that I was overanalyzing things. That stress can make memories feel heavier than they are. Someone else had chimed in, trying to help. Maybe I was still processing. Maybe I needed to let it go. The words were gentle, but the effect was immediate. The conversation shifted from what happened to what was wrong with me. I remembered how quickly my facts stopped mattering once my emotions were named. After that, it happened every time. If I pushed back, I was told I was stuck in the past. If I insisted on details, I was accused of needing drama. My sister stayed calm, and calm was treated like credibility. The contrast worked in her favor without her ever having to say it out loud. So I learned. I learned that speaking didn't always mean being heard. Sometimes it meant being labeled. I learned that the more I tried to clarify, the more attention was drawn to my tone instead of my words. I learned that explanations, once framed as defensiveness, lose their power. Standing there by the sink, I understood why I had gone quiet. It wasn't fear, it was pattern recognition. I stopped preparing responses in my head after that. I stopped rehearsing how I would phrase things so no one could accuse me of being emotional. The effort had never paid off anyway. Every sentence I offered became another opportunity for someone to explain me away. Instead, I started listening. At first, listening hurt. I'd hear my sister tell the story and feel my body react, muscles tightening, breath catching. But over time, that reaction faded. The words lost their sting and started to sound repetitive, almost mechanical. That was when I noticed how much she talked when no one challenged her. She filled every silence. She added color, then detail, then reassurance. She answered questions no one had asked. The longer she spoke, the more confident she became, as if the absence of resistance proved she was right. I let her have that silence. While she talked, I paid attention to different things. Not how it made me feel, but how it was built. I listened for sequence instead of meaning. I noticed when she said something happened before something else, how she always placed certain events in the same order. I didn't argue with myself about whether I remembered it differently. I didn't try to reconstruct my experience from memory. Memory, I'd learned, was too easy to dismiss. Instead, I asked quieter questions. What came first? What followed? What required time? Once I started listening that way, the story changed shape. It stopped sounding convincing and started sounding fragile. It relied heavily on implication and very little on specifics. When details appeared, they were vague enough to slide around without being pinned down. I could see why it worked. Most people don't think in timelines, they think in impressions. And her impression was neat. Mine was not. The shift inside me was subtle but decisive. I stopped wanting to correct her. I stopped feeling the urgency to be understood in those moments. The desire to argue drained away, replaced by something steadier. I realized that arguing facts with someone who controlled the narrative was a losing game. Any correction I offered would be absorbed, reframed, or dismissed. Worse, it would give her the chance to refine her story, to smooth out weak spots before anyone else noticed them. Silence, on the other hand, left her exposed to her own confidence. The more she believed she'd won, the less careful she became. She stopped hedging. She stopped leaving things open-ended. She spoke as if the order of events were obvious, shared knowledge. That was when the story stopped hurting. It didn't feel personal anymore. It felt structural. I remember the exact moment that realization settled in. She was talking again, recounting everything in that same steady rhythm, and I caught myself not reacting at all. No tightness, no rush of heat. Just a quiet note in my mind when she placed one event too neatly after another. That didn't go there. I didn't feel angry when I noticed it. I felt alert. From that point on, my silence had a different quality. It wasn't empty. It was deliberate. I was no longer waiting for someone to give me space to speak. I was waiting for the story to show me where it depended on order to survive. I knew then that I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to persuade anyone. I needed to let the narrative keep going long enough to reveal its own limits. Time has a way of doing that. And as my sister continued talking, confident and unchallenged, I realized I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I was watching the clock. I heard it again the next time my sister told the story, and this time my body reacted before my thoughts did. She was leaning against the table, arms folded loosely, her voice steady as she walked through the same familiar version. Symptoms out of nowhere. Tests right away, nothing found. Stress afterward. I had heard it so many times by then that the words themselves barely registered. But then she placed one moment where it didn't belong. She said the medication discussion happened after the doctors had already ruled everything out. The sentence slid by smoothly, but something in me stopped short. Not emotionally, physically, like missing a step on a staircase. That wasn't right. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't frown or tilt my head. I kept my face neutral and let the conversation continue as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, everything slowed down. It wasn't about memory. I didn't argue with myself about what I thought I remembered. Memory could be doubted, reshaped, dismissed. I had learned that the hard way. This was about order. I told myself I would check one thing, just one. Not to prove anything yet, not to confront anyone, just to ground myself in something solid. I waited until later that night, when the house was quiet and there was no one left to perform calmness for. I opened my laptop and pulled up the appointment portal. The screen loaded slowly, and I noticed how steady my hands were. There was no rush in me anymore, no urgency to defend myself. I was curious, almost detached. The date was there, exactly where it had always been. It didn't match her story, not by a few days, by weeks. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, letting the information settle without turning it into emotion. There it was in plain text, neutral and unarguable. The discussion she had placed near the end of everything had happened much earlier, before several other decisions she insisted came first. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt precise. One date didn't mean everything, I knew that. It could be explained away, reframed, softened. But it also wasn't nothing, it was a fixed point, and fixed points change how you see everything around them. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark for a moment, thinking not about what I would say, but about what I would not say. Correcting her now would be a mistake. If I pointed out this one error, she would adjust. She would shift the story, smooth it over, learn where she needed to be more careful. Early corrections don't expose lies. They improve them. I wasn't interested in helping her improve. The next time she told the story, I listened differently. I wasn't reacting to the implications anymore. I was listening for structure, for sequence, for the quiet assumptions the story depended on to make sense. She spoke with confidence, unaware that her certainty had become a liability. Every time she repeated the same order, she reinforced it. Every time she added a detail, she narrowed her options. I noticed how she avoided dates unless she felt safe. When she did mention timing, it was vague. Early on, later, around that time. Enough to sound informed without being pinned down. Except for that one slip. I carried it with me quietly, like a key I wasn't ready to use. The strangest part was how little it hurt now. Her words no longer scraped against my sense of self. They floated past me, unhooked from emotion. The story had stopped being about me and started being about her confidence in something she hadn't verified. I began to understand why she hadn't checked anything. She didn't need to. Her version worked because no one asked questions. It was clean, comforting, and complete. It asked for belief, not inspection. In a family that preferred resolution over accuracy, that was enough. I saw it clearly then. Her story could only survive if no one lined things up. That night marked a shift. I stopped thinking about defending myself entirely. I stopped rehearsing explanations I would never give. My focus narrowed to something simpler. Counting days between appointments, counting the gap between symptoms and decisions, counting the space between what was said and what was documented. Not to catch her out in a dramatic moment, but to understand the full shape of what she was relying on. The more I counted, the more fragile the structure appeared. I still didn't speak, not when she repeated the mistake, not when someone nodded along. Not when a correction would have been easy and tempting. Silence, I had learned, did something interesting in situations like this. It made people careless. It allowed them to believe they were no longer being observed. She grew more relaxed, more certain. She stopped watching my face when she talked. She assumed, I think, that I had accepted her version, that I'd retreated into myself the way she always expected I would. What she didn't see was that I was no longer reacting at all. I wasn't waiting for the right words. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't waiting for someone to ask me what really happened. I was waiting for the story to depend on itself. Once a narrative relies on order, once it asks time to cooperate, it becomes vulnerable in a way emotion never is. Feelings can be argued with, memories can be questioned, but sequence is unforgiving. That night, as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I felt something close to calm. She could keep telling the story as confidently as she liked. I didn't need to stop her. I had started counting. And once you start counting, stories like hers don't hold together for long. I stopped listening for mistakes and started looking for records. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no surge of emotion behind it, no moment of resolve that felt cinematic. It was practical, almost boring. If the story depended on order, then order was what I needed to see. I requested my medical records the way people do when they're finished arguing with themselves. The portal asked for confirmations, dates of service, permissions. Everything about the process was impersonal, procedural, designed to remove interpretation. That alone felt grounding. When the files arrived, I didn't open them right away. I set them aside and made a cup of tea, noticing how quiet the kitchen was. My hands didn't shake, my thoughts weren't racing. Whatever this was now, it wasn't panic. I sat down and opened the first document. The language was clinical and flat. No adjectives, no conclusions, just notes, times, signatures. It didn't care how anyone felt about what had happened. It simply recorded what had occurred, when, and what followed. The first thing that stood out was the progression. Symptoms didn't explode into existence the way my sister described. They accumulated, slowly, measurably. Each appointment referenced the one before it, a chain rather than a shock. I scrolled, reading dates, letting them stack in my mind. The words themselves meant less than their placement. This came before that. This decision followed that result. The story on the page moved forward the way real things do. Her version required chaos. The records showed order. I reached a section that made me pause. A medication adjustment. The note was brief, almost dismissive, but the date was unmistakable. It happened before the point she always cited as the end of concern, before the moment she claimed doctors had ruled everything out. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to savor the contradiction, but to acknowledge it. This wasn't a discrepancy. It was a structural failure. If that change occurred when it did, then the story she told could not exist as she told it. Not without rearranging reality. And reality, unlike memory, doesn't rearrange quietly. I kept reading. Follow-up orders. Recommendations. A timeline that didn't spike and vanish but unfolded. There were decisions made earlier than she ever admitted. Conversations that had been documented weeks before she claimed anyone took things seriously. What surprised me wasn't how much evidence there was. It was how little she would have needed to check to avoid being wrong. She hadn't checked because she didn't think she had to. Her confidence had always carried her. She trusted her memory because no one challenged it. She trusted her tone because it had worked before. She trusted the room to follow her lead, and it always had. Comfort breeds oversight. I didn't feel angry as I sorted the documents. I felt methodical. I arranged them chronologically, not by type or category, but by sequence. Appointments first, tests next, adjustments after that. I removed duplicates, highlighted dates, made sure everything flowed forward without gaps. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a map. The map was calm. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't defend me. It simply showed how one thing led to another, how concern built, how decisions evolved. It showed a reality that didn't need interpretation to be understood. I realized then that I didn't need to show this to anyone yet, not to my parents, not to a doctor, not even to myself in the way I once would have, searching for validation. Keeping it private was part of the process. If I revealed this too early, it would become something to manage. People would want explanations, caveats, context. My sister would want to respond. She would find ways to soften the edges, to claim misunderstanding, to reframe what the documents meant. I wasn't interested in a discussion. I wanted inevitability, so I kept it to myself and let her keep talking. The next time she told the story, I noticed how confidently she placed events in the wrong order, how easily she moved past moments that the records lingered on, how comfortable she was, assuming no one would ever line things up. She was right about one thing, no one else had. But I had. And now that I'd seen the full picture, her words sounded different. Not convincing. Exposed. Like a structure built on assumptions that no longer applied. I began to understand that her story wasn't slightly wrong. It was impossible. There was no version of events where her sequence held together once dates were involved. It relied entirely on no one asking for verification, on the idea that confidence could replace chronology. I closed the folder and set it aside, feeling no urge to confront her or correct the narrative that continued to circulate. Every sentence she added now worked against her. Every retelling reinforced a version that could not survive contact with the timeline I had assembled. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because the past had changed, but because it had finally stopped shifting under me. The records were steady. They didn't flinch or soften. They didn't care who told the story more smoothly. In the morning, I heard my sister on the phone, laughing, recounting the same familiar version to someone else. I poured my coffee and listened from the other room, detached, almost serene. She sounded confident. I smiled to myself, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. She could keep telling the story. She could keep polishing it, repeating it, spreading it. I didn't need to interrupt. Every word she added was another step away from reality. And reality, I had learned, keeps excellent records. By the time I had the records organized, the family had already chosen her version. I could hear it in the way conversations flowed now. No one asked questions anymore. They made statements. Short, settled ones. The story had become a fact people referenced, not something up for discussion. My sister's voice echoed through other people's mouths, softened and normalized. I carried the proof quietly while listening to them repeat what they believed. At dinner, my mother mentioned how hard that period had been for everyone, how stressful it was when nothing serious ever showed up. She said it gently, almost apologetically, like she was smoothing over something fragile. I nodded and passed the salt. An uncle joked that I always had a flair for drama, then immediately added that he meant it affectionately. I smiled and let the moment slide. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was relieved. That was when it became clear to me. This wasn't about loyalty to my sister, it was about protection from discomfort. Her story let them off the hook. If my illness had been sudden and unfounded, then no one had missed the signs. No one had brushed off early warnings. No one had delayed action or trusted reassurance when they shouldn't have. Believing her meant believing they had all done their best. Believing me would have required something harder. I watched how carefully people avoided the edges of the topic now. They spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from wanting something to be finished. It wasn't malice, it was fatigue. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of the waiting, tired of not knowing what to say. Her version gave them an ending. In that ending, I had a role. I was the sensitive one, the one who took things too seriously, the one who couldn't let go. It wasn't stated outright, but it was implied in the pauses, the careful tone people used around me, the way they changed subjects when I lingered too long. I felt it most when people stopped asking how I was doing. They assumed I was fine now. The tests were clear. The scare was over. Any lingering discomfort was treated as emotional, not physical. A mindset issue, something I needed to work through quietly. It was a strange kind of isolation, being present but not quite included. Conversations happened around me instead of with me. I became someone to manage rather than understand. And through it all, my sister grew more confident. She spoke more freely, adding color to her retellings. She corrected people when they misremembered details, guiding them back to the version she preferred. She sounded practiced, assured, like someone who believed the narrative was sealed. I didn't challenge her. I didn't even look at her when she talked. Inside, something had shifted. I no longer felt the pull to be understood by them. That desire had worn itself out. The need for their approval dissolved quietly, without ceremony. I understood then that waiting for them to validate me was another way of staying trapped. The records had already given me what I needed. They didn't care who believed them yet. They existed regardless. I didn't need agreement to know what was real. That realization brought an unexpected calm. I stopped monitoring their reactions. I stopped measuring my words. I stopped wondering if today would be the day someone finally asked the right question. I let the conversations wash over me without absorbing them. When my sister spoke, I listened with the same detached attention I'd learned to give to weather reports. Not invested, just observant. And she noticed. Not consciously, I think, but in the way people sense when an audience has stopped reacting. She filled the space more aggressively after that. She added details where she hadn't before, offered explanations no one requested. She wanted control, and control requires attention. I saw the pattern forming. The more secure she felt in the family's acceptance, the less careful she became. She assumed the story was done, that no one would revisit it, least of all me. That assumption made her comfortable. Comfort made her careless. One afternoon, she told the story again while I sat nearby, pretending to scroll through my phone. She placed an event confidently in the timeline, anchoring it with a phrase she hadn't used before. A specific point, a moment she treated as unquestionable. I felt the familiar internal click, the quiet recognition. She had done it again. I didn't react. I didn't even look up. I let the moment pass as if it meant nothing. But inside, I noted it precisely and added it to the structure I was already holding. The family laughed. Someone agreed with her. The conversation moved on. I realized then that their choice of her version had created the conditions for its collapse. By accepting it so fully, they had allowed her to stop guarding it. She believed she was safe, that no one would ever compare notes or ask for proof. She believed the room belonged to her. I no longer needed it to. That night, alone, I reviewed the records again, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to see the story the way it actually unfolded. I traced the sequence from start to finish, watching how concern built naturally, how decisions followed one another logically. There was no chaos in it, no overreaction, just a body responding, doctors adjusting, time doing what time always does. The contrast was stark. I closed the folder and set it aside, feeling no urgency to act. The family had chosen her story, and that choice had freed me from needing to persuade them. All I had to do now was wait. Not for them to listen. For her to slip far enough that even comfort couldn't cover it. And I could feel that moment approaching, slow and inevitable, as she continued talking, confident and unchecked, unaware that the very certainty she relied on was leading her straight into contradiction. I could feel the shift before I could name it. My sister stopped hedging her words. She no longer softened her statements or left room for interpretation. When she told the story now, she spoke as if the facts had been agreed upon long ago, as if there was nothing left to clarify. Her tone had changed from explanatory to authoritative. She owned the story. It showed in small ways at first. She corrected people mid-sentence when they summarized it imperfectly. She supplied details no one had asked for. She laughed lightly when someone hesitated, as if uncertainty itself were quaint. I watched it happen without reacting. The family followed her lead. They deferred to her when questions came up, even indirect ones. If someone wondered aloud about timing or sequence, she answered before anyone else could, smoothing over the moment with confidence. Her calmness filled the room and left no space for doubt. That kind of certainty is intoxicating. It makes people relax. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while she talked, I noticed something new. She added a detail she hadn't used before. It was subtle, tucked into the middle of her explanation, but it caught my attention immediately. She described a specific decision, naming it clearly, and placed it firmly in the timeline. Not vaguely, not around that time. She anchored it. I felt the familiar internal stillness settle over me. This detail mattered. Before, her story had relied on flexibility. Events floated just enough that they couldn't be pinned down. Now she was doing the opposite. She was adding precision. And precision is dangerous when it isn't supported by reality. I didn't look up. I didn't tense. I let her keep talking, committing herself further. She repeated the detail later that same day, this time with even more certainty. She framed it as proof that everything had been handled responsibly, that concerns had been addressed in the proper order. People nodded along, reassured by the clarity. I memorized the phrasing. It was important that she said it more than once. Repetition transforms a statement into a position. It leaves less room for retreat. Inside, I felt no surge of triumph, only readiness. I understood now why this moment mattered more than all the others. Her expanded version required a very specific sequence of events. It wasn't about interpretation or emotion. It depended on one thing happening before another. And I knew with complete certainty that it hadn't. This wasn't a gray area. It wasn't something that could be argued away with tone or intent. The records I had already organized contradicted her new detail cleanly and decisively. She had stepped into a corner without realizing it. What struck me most was how comfortable she seemed. She leaned back, spoke freely, smiled easily. She had no sense that she'd crossed a line, because in her mind the story was finished. The family had accepted it. I had stayed quiet. There was no resistance left to anticipate. Comfort does that. It dulls caution. I watched her talk the way you watch someone walk across thin ice they believe is solid. There was no cruelty in it, no desire to see her fall, just an awareness of what happens when confidence outruns verification. I did nothing with the mistake right away. That restraint mattered. If I had reacted, even subtly, she might have sensed it. She might have reconsidered, adjusted, walked the detail back before it hardened. Silence allowed the error to exist unchallenged, and errors, when left alone, tend to multiply. Over the next few days, she referenced the same point again, weaving it more tightly into her narrative. Each time she did, she reinforced it. Each repetition locked her in deeper. People began to repeat it too. That was the moment I knew there was no turning back. Once others borrow a mistake, it becomes part of the shared story. It stops belonging to the person who made it. I felt strangely calm watching it happen. The anxiety that had once gripped me in these situations was gone. In its place was a steady sense of inevitability. This wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about letting the structure reveal itself. I stayed silent through it all, not passive, deliberate. My silence had changed meaning by then. It was no longer read as withdrawal or embarrassment. It was simply there, unremarkable, allowing the story to move without interference. That invisibility was useful. Inside, I was counting. Not days this time, but distance. How far her version had drifted from the documented sequence. How much weight it now carried. How many people had heard the same incorrect order. Every added layer increased the stakes. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone and reviewed the timeline again. Not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to see the contrast clearly. Her version and reality side by side, not to argue, but to understand. The gap was undeniable. I closed the folder and set it down, feeling something settle in me that I hadn't expected. Patience, not the strained kind that comes from suppression, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing the outcome. She had given me what I needed without realizing it, a fixed point, a claim that could be checked, a moment that would not bend. From that point on, the collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a matter of timing. I didn't need her to keep talking, but she did. Confident people always do. Each retelling reinforced the same flawed sequence, spreading it wider, embedding it deeper. She believed she had won because no one was challenging her. What she didn't understand was that challenges aren't always loud. Sometimes they wait. And as I listened to her speak, relaxed and assured, I knew with absolute certainty that she had crossed her own line. She had turned a flexible story into a rigid one. And rigid stories don't survive contact with time. From that moment on, I stopped wondering if the truth would surface. I started wondering how long it would take. I stopped collecting mistakes and started building something solid. There was no drama in it. No moment where I spread papers across a table and felt a rush of satisfaction. It was quieter than that, almost meditative. I knew by then that individual errors could be dismissed. A structure could not. I cleared a space and laid everything out in order. Appointments first, then test results, then notes, then medication changes. Not by importance, not by category, but by time. one thing leading to the next, each step anchored to a date and a signature. As the sequence took shape, the noise fell away. What I saw wasn't chaos or confusion, it was progression. Symptoms building, responses adjusting. Decisions made, revised, followed up. The story moved forward the way real lives do, not in sharp turns but in measured steps. Her version needed disorder. Mine had none. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the last piece slid into place. Not relief, control. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't reacting to someone else's narrative. I was holding the full picture in my hands. Once I could see the entire timeline at once, I realized something else. I didn't need her to speak again. Everything she could possibly add had already been accounted for. Any new detail would either fit into the sequence or contradict it. The structure didn't require maintenance. It existed independently of her confidence. That realization changed how I listened to her afterward. When she told the story again, I heard it as a finished object, no longer fluid, no longer evolving. She repeated the same order she'd committed to, the same anchored points, the same confident conclusions. Each retelling made the contrast sharper. I kept the timeline to myself. The temptation to show it to someone was real. There were moments when I imagined placing it gently on the table, letting the dates speak, watching faces shift. But I resisted that urge. Partial exposure would only invite debate. People would want to discuss interpretations, offer explanations, soften edges. I wasn't interested in softening anything. Timing mattered as much as truth. Revealed too early, even the strongest evidence becomes something to manage. Revealed in the right context, it becomes something to accept. So I waited. In the meantime, I watched her grow more certain. She spoke with increasing assurance, correcting even minor deviations in how others repeated the story. She treated the timeline she had invented as settled fact, never imagining it would be questioned. Confidence, I'd learned, creates its own blind spots. The more she repeated the story, the more rigid it became. She stopped hedging. She stopped using approximations. She relied on the same sequence every time, unaware that rigidity is what makes things break. I listened without reacting, without engaging, without offering so much as a raised eyebrow. My lack of response seemed to reassure her. She no longer glanced at me for cues. She assumed, I think, that I'd fully retreated. That invisibility was useful. Inside, I was finished preparing. There was nothing left to add, nothing left to verify. The timeline was complete, not because I felt satisfied, but because it could no longer be improved. It stood on its own. I remember sitting alone one evening, the folder closed beside me, and realizing that I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the situation was resolved, but because the uncertainty was gone. I knew exactly where everything belonged. Whatever happened next, I would not be scrambling. The strange part was how little anger I felt. That emotion had burned itself out earlier, replaced by something steadier. This wasn't about proving my sister wrong anymore. It was about letting reality exist in the same space as her story. She was still talking. The family was still listening. Nothing outward had changed. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. The distance between her narrative and the documented sequence had grown too wide to ignore. The two could no longer occupy the same space without conflict. All that remained was the moment they would be forced to meet. And that moment, I could tell, was approaching. There are times when preparation feels like waiting for a storm. This didn't. It felt like waiting for the tide. Slow, predictable, unstoppable. I didn't need to orchestrate anything. I didn't need to push for confrontation. Circumstances have a way of arranging those things on their own. As she continued to speak with confidence, adding nothing new but reinforcing what she'd already said, I watched the distance widen. Each repetition made the eventual comparison more inevitable. I wasn't anxious about it anymore. I was ready. The story was finished. So was the timeline. All that was left was the moment when they would be placed side by side, and one of them would have to give way. I closed the folder and set it aside, not out of fear of being discovered, but because I didn't need to look at it again. I already knew how this would end, and for the first time, I was content to let time handle the rest. The room itself changed the moment we sat down. It wasn't a place where stories could wander freely. The table was too bare, the chairs too straight-backed, the atmosphere too formal for casual retellings. Accuracy mattered here, even if no one said it out loud. The kind of space where people expect things to line up. My sister walked in like she always did, confident and unhurried. She took her seat without hesitation, greeting everyone with the ease of someone who believed she belonged at the center of the conversation. I took my place quietly, the folder not in my hands, not on the table, not visible at all. I didn't need it there yet. She began the story again when the topic came up, slipping into her familiar rhythm as if this were just another living room, just another informal exchange. Symptoms appeared suddenly. Tests came back clean. Concern followed confusion. Her voice didn't waver. She had told it so many times that it no longer felt like a story to her. It felt like memory. I watched faces around the table. Heads nodded. Pens hovered. No one interrupted her. For a moment, it seemed like the room might bend to her confidence the way others had. Then a question came. It wasn't sharp or accusatory. It didn't sound like a challenge. It was the kind of question people ask when they're trying to be precise, not when they're trying to expose anyone. A simple clarification about sequence. About when something happened in relation to something else. She answered immediately. That was her first mistake. She placed the event exactly where she always had, anchoring it firmly in the order she'd committed to. She spoke with certainty, as if the timeline were obvious, shared knowledge. I didn't react. I didn't shift in my chair or glance at anyone. Inside, I felt only confirmation. The question was repeated, just slightly reframed, before or after a specific appointment. Before or after a particular decision. Still neutral, still careful. This time she hesitated. It was brief, barely noticeable. But it was there. A pause where there hadn't been one before. She tried to explain instead of answer, adding context, describing feelings, emphasizing intentions. But intention wasn't what the room was asking for. The follow-up was even simpler. Dates. Just dates. I became aware then of how quiet I was, not deliberately silent, just still. My role in the room had shifted without me doing anything at all. People glanced at me briefly, then looked back to her, then to the center of the table where nothing was laid out yet. Her confidence began to thin. She repeated herself, then adjusted, then repeated again. Each explanation pulled her further from the clarity she'd relied on. The story that had sounded so neat in other settings struggled under the weight of specificity. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Someone asked to verify the sequence, just to be sure, just to confirm. The tone was polite, professional, impossible to argue with. That was when the documents came into play. They weren't presented dramatically. No one slid them across the table with a flourish. They were referenced the way records are always referenced, as a matter of course, as something ordinary and unquestionable. Dates were read aloud. Not opinions, not interpretations, just dates. The first one landed softly, but it didn't align with what she'd said. She tried to reconcile it, suggesting memory can blur under stress, that everyone experiences time differently. Another date followed, then another. The order emerged without commentary. Appointment, test, follow-up, adjustment. Each step laid out calmly, patiently, in a sequence that didn't rush or accuse. The timeline spoke in its own voice, steady and impersonal. I watched her face change, not dramatically, but in small, controlled ways. Her eyes moved more often now, tracking the conversation, searching for a place to regain footing. Her answers grew shorter. No one raised their voice. No one looked at me for confirmation. They didn't need to. The room wasn't interested in sides anymore. It was interested in order. For the first time since all of this began, my silence wasn't read as absence. It was simply irrelevant. The story no longer needed defending. It was being compared. Another date was read. This one couldn't be explained away. It directly contradicted the sequence she had repeated so confidently. There was no interpretation that made both versions true. She stopped speaking. Not abruptly. Not in defeat. She just ran out of space to continue. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that, the kind of silence that follows realization. No one rushed to fill it. There was nothing left to say. I felt a strange sense of distance, as if I were watching the scene from just outside myself. Not detached, exactly, but grounded. This wasn't a victory, it was a settling. I hadn't said a word. The timeline had done all the work. Someone finally spoke, gently suggesting they move on to the next item on the agenda. The conversation shifted, careful and subdued. No one looked at my sister the same way they had when she'd walked in. No one looked at me differently either. And that was the point. As we stood to leave, I caught a glimpse of her profile. She looked composed, but something essential had slipped away. Not her place in the family. Not her dignity. Something quieter. Control. I walked out of the room without meeting her eyes, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to exchange. The comparison had been made. The sequence was clear. Outside, the air felt cooler. I took a breath and let it out slowly, aware of how steady I felt. The story had finally been placed where it belonged, next to time, and time, once consulted, had answered without hesitation. The room felt colder once the dates were spoken aloud. Not physically, but in the way attention sharpens when something irreversible has begun. Conversations that drifted moments earlier now moved carefully, as if everyone sensed that guessing was no longer allowed. This wasn't about impressions anymore. It was about order. The first date was read without emphasis. A simple reference, stated neutrally, pulled from a record no one questioned. It didn't match the sequence my sister had insisted on. She tried to respond quickly, suggesting memory could blur under stress, that timelines can feel different when emotions are involved. No one argued with her. They just read the next date. It came from a different document, a different source, but it slid into place as if it had always belonged there. Appointment, test, follow-up. The structure began to emerge on its own, not as an accusation, but as a progression. I stayed still in my chair, hands folded in my lap, my presence barely registered. No one looked at me. No one needed to. The focus had shifted entirely to the sequence unfolding in front of us. My sister's confidence began to thin, not all at once, but in layers. Her answers shortened. She stopped elaborating and started nodding. The calm certainty she'd relied on gave way to careful listening, as if she were trying to catch the story before it outran her. Another date followed. This one couldn't be softened. It landed squarely in the space she had claimed was empty. The medication change. The recommendation. The signature at the bottom of the page. It all happened before the moment she'd described as resolution. Time did not cooperate with her version. Someone pointed out the order gently, not as a challenge, but as an observation. The tone remained professional, almost courteous. There was no satisfaction in it, no desire to expose. Just a recognition that the sequence spoke clearly. I felt something loosen inside me then. For months, I had carried the tension of needing to be understood, of wanting someone to finally see what I had lived through. That tension dissolved quietly as the records did what I never could. They removed the need for performance. The timeline continued to assemble itself step by step, without commentary. Each piece reinforced the last. What had sounded plausible in conversation became impossible on paper. The story my sister told didn't collapse dramatically. It simply failed to align. She stopped trying to explain. Her silence wasn't defensive. It was resigned. She sat back slightly, listening now, no longer leading. The authority she'd carried into the room had evaporated, not because anyone took it from her, but because it no longer applied. No one looked at her for answers. No one looked at me either. The power dynamic shifted without a single word being exchanged between us. It wasn't a reversal so much as a leveling. The story had been reduced to what it was, a narrative unsupported by sequence. I realized then how little I wanted from this moment. There was no rush of triumph, no desire to speak up now that the truth was visible. I didn't need to clarify anything or add context. Everything that mattered was already there, laid out cleanly, chronologically beyond interpretation. Another signature was noted, another confirmation. The room grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't tense, it was settled. People absorbed the information in their own ways, adjusting their understanding without comment. No one apologized. No one confronted. There was nothing left to argue. The story had lost its center. I thought back briefly to all the times I had been told I was too sensitive, too focused on details, too unwilling to move on. Sitting there now, I felt none of that weight. The details everyone once dismissed were doing exactly what they were meant to do. They were telling the truth. Someone suggested moving on to the next topic, and the meeting shifted gears with surprising ease. The records were gathered. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Normalcy crept back into the room, altered but intact. My sister didn't speak to me as we stood up. She didn't need to. The conversation between us had already happened, mediated by dates and documents rather than words. As I walked out, I noticed how steady my steps felt. There was no adrenaline, no aftershock, just a quiet sense of completion. The story I had lived through was no longer floating, vulnerable to retelling. It had been anchored. Outside, the air felt clearer, as if something had been cleared away. I took a breath and let it out slowly, aware of how calm my body felt. Not numb, not relieved, grounded. Time had spoken for me. It hadn't raised its voice or demanded attention. It had simply arranged itself patiently, in a way that could not be ignored. Everything that had once been questioned now sat where it belonged. I didn't need to say a word then, and I knew I wouldn't need to later. The truth didn't belong to me to defend anymore. It belonged to time. And time, once finally listened to, had done exactly what it always does. It told the story straight. The room didn't erupt after the truth settled. There was no confrontation, no sharp exchange, no moment where anyone demanded explanations. The records had already done their work. What followed was quieter than I expected, a kind of suspended calm that made every movement feel deliberate. People avoided eye contact at first, not out of guilt exactly, but recalibration. They were adjusting to a reality that no longer fit the story they'd been repeating. Papers stayed on the table longer than necessary, as if no one quite knew when it was appropriate to gather them up. My sister sat very still. She hadn't been exposed in the way people imagine exposure. No one pointed at her. No one accused her of lying. There was no humiliation. And yet, something essential had shifted. The attention that once flowed naturally toward her had dried up without announcement. No one asked her what she thought next. That was the moment I understood what she had lost. It wasn't her place in the family. It wasn't affection or access. It was narrative authority. The quiet assumption that her version of events would be accepted without verification. That assumption had dissolved, leaving nothing dramatic in its place. Just absence. Power doesn't always break. Sometimes it evaporates. The conversation resumed cautiously after a few minutes, moving to neutral topics with practiced ease. Someone mentioned schedules. Someone else brought up logistics. Life, it seemed, was eager to continue now that the tension had been resolved. But the tone was different. When people spoke to me, they paused first, just a fraction longer than before. Their voices softened, not in pity but in recognition. They didn't ask questions, and they didn't apologize. They adjusted. That adjustment mattered more than words ever could. I noticed it when my mother asked if I was feeling okay, and waited for my answer without interrupting. I noticed it when an aunt nodded at something I said instead of redirecting the conversation. Small gestures, almost invisible, but unmistakable. I didn't feel vindicated. Vindication implies an argument has been won. This didn't feel like that. It felt like a correction, quiet and overdue, finally applied. There was also something no one said out loud, something that hung between us like a shared understanding. That believing my sister's story had been easier, that it had spared them discomfort, that choosing her version had meant not looking too closely at their own roles. No one named that truth. They didn't need to. Families are skilled at recognizing the edge of a conversation and stepping back from it together. This was one of those moments. The acknowledgement existed without language, and perhaps that was enough. My sister stood up shortly after, smoothing her clothes, her posture composed. She didn't look at me, and I didn't look at her. Not because there was hostility between us, but because the exchange we'd been circling for months had finally ended. There was nothing left to say. I watched her leave the room and felt something surprising in its wake. Not satisfaction, not relief. Balance. The scale had tipped back to neutral. Later, as people began to drift out, someone touched my arm lightly and said they were glad everything was clear now. The phrasing was careful, clear, not resolved, not forgiven, just clear. I nodded, accepting the word for what it was. Clarity had been all I wanted from the beginning. That evening, alone again, I thought about how differently the day might have gone if I'd chosen to argue earlier, if I'd tried to force understanding before the structure was ready. I imagined how easily the story could have been patched, how quickly doubt could have been redirected back onto me. I felt grateful for my patience. Not the strained kind that comes from endurance, but the deliberate kind that comes from restraint. The kind that allows truth to exist without defending itself prematurely. I also thought about my sister, not with anger, but with distance. She hadn't been destroyed by what happened. She hadn't been cast out or stripped of dignity. She had simply lost the ability to define reality for everyone else. That loss was permanent. No amount of confidence would restore it. No retelling would reclaim the space she once occupied. The family would listen differently now. Question gently where they hadn't before. Notice order where they once accepted tone. The damage had been done. So had the repair. I realized then that closure doesn't always arrive with apologies or admissions. Sometimes it comes as a shift in posture, a recalibration of trust, a quiet return of credibility to the person who lost it. I felt that return in my own body, in the way I no longer braced myself before speaking, in the way my thoughts felt less crowded. The constant background noise of self-defense had faded. For the first time in a long while, my story belonged to me again. Not because I had reclaimed it with words, but because it no longer needed protection. As I turned off the lights that night, I didn't feel triumphant or exhausted. I felt steady. The kind of steadiness that comes after something has been set back into its proper place. The story was no longer hers to tell, and it never would be again. Life didn't change overnight after that. There was no dramatic fallout, no family gathering where everything was rehashed and resolved. Instead, things settled in small, almost unremarkable ways. Conversations continued. Holidays were planned. People laughed at the same jokes they always had. On the surface, nothing looked different, but the air had shifted. I noticed it in the pauses. The half-second longer someone waited before finishing my sentence for me. The way questions were asked instead of assumptions made. The absence of that familiar tone people used when they thought they knew my story better than I did. I wasn't being watched anymore. For the first time in a long while, I moved through my days without rehearsing explanations in my head. I didn't brace myself before family calls. I didn't feel the need to clarify, soften, or preemptively defend my own memories. The constant background tension I'd grown used to had quietly faded. What surprised me most was how little I thought about my sister, not out of bitterness or denial, but because she no longer occupied the same space in my mind. Her version of events had lost its power, and with it, the hold it had on me. She was still part of the family, still present, still herself. But she wasn't the narrator anymore. I realized then that this had never been just about illness. It was about authorship, about who gets to define what happened and who is expected to accept being edited out of their own experience. In families like ours, the calmest voice often wins, not because it's right, but because it's convenient. Comfort masquerades as truth more often than we like to admit. For a long time, I had thought justice would feel louder. I imagined a moment of vindication, of being seen all at once, of finally being believed in a way that erased the past. But that wasn't how it arrived. Justice came quietly. It arrived in the form of alignment. When what was said could no longer contradict what had happened. When time itself stepped in and did what arguments never could. I understood something important then. Emotions can be reframed. Intentions can be questioned. Memories can be blurred or dismissed as perspective. Time cannot. Time leaves a trail whether we want it to or not. Appointments, decisions, changes, signatures. It records without bias and waits patiently for someone to look. That was the one thing my sister had forgotten. She could rewrite the story, polish it, repeat it until it sounded inevitable. But she couldn't rewrite when things happened, and she didn't need to be punished for that truth to matter. I didn't confront her afterward. There was no final conversation where everything was laid bare. There didn't need to be. The balance had already been restored, not through force, but through clarity. I learned something else too. Not every lie needs to be fought head-on. Not every distortion deserves an immediate response. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step back and let reality accumulate. Let the timeline speak. Today, when someone misstates something about my past, I don't rush to correct them. I don't feel that familiar surge of panic. I know now that I don't have to win every moment to protect the truth of my life. If someone insists on rewriting my story, I let time respond. It always does. If you've ever sat quietly while someone else told your story for you, I want you to know this. Silence doesn't always mean you've lost. Sometimes it means you're choosing a different kind of power. A slower one, a steadier one that doesn't rely on volume or approval. If parts of this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Many people carry experiences that were minimized, reframed, or rewritten by those who found comfort in simpler versions. If that's you, you're welcome here. You can share your story in the comments if you want. Or you can just let yourself be seen without explaining anything at all. Both are enough. And if you want to hear more real stories about quiet strength, family dynamics, and the moments where truth finally catches up, stay with this channel. Subscribe and come back. This is a place for stories that were once dismissed. Time has a way of bringing them home.